Okay, everyone, so I will begin this afternoon's session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the IEA Bioenergy Webinar series hosted by the Canadian Institute of Forestry. My name is Natasha Machado, and I'll be moderating today's session. Today is Thursday, December 13, 2018, and we are very pleased to have Oscar Ungland and Uffe Jorgensen with us today, who will present on biomass production in sustainably managed landscapes. We are also very pleased to have Joran Brendes, who will be the moderator for today's session and introduce today's speakers. So to start things off, Joran is a professor in biomass and land use at the Department of Space, Earth and Environment at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. His research integrates land use, energy, and industrial systems at scales ranging from local case studies to the global context. In recent years, the research has specifically focused on analyzing systems and development pathways for societies, land use, and biomass use in light of the Paris Climate Agreement. Joran has been engaged in IEA Bioenergy for about 10 years and will lead a new task, Climate and Sustainability Impacts of Bioenergy within the broader bioeconomy during the period of 2019 to 2021. Starting in 2019, he will also take on the role of coordinating lead author in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. And with that, I will now pass it along to Joran to introduce today's topic and the speakers for today's session.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope you all hear me now. I will not waste even more of your time to try to explain what happened. Instead, I will run you through a quite brief introduction before I introduce the two speakers we have today. This webinar you will listen to now that is associated with an intertask project that we have had in our implementing agreement in IEA, so the IEA Bioenergy. And the webinar today is then titled Biomass Production in Sustainably Managed Landscapes. I think I can shift the slides myself, Natasha, or will you help me with that? Oh, it works fine. Okay, now I think I went one too far. Let's see. Okay, so this Intertask project, which has been a rather extensive project running for 3 years and led by Martin Junginger, who is also the task leader Task 40, it has had the title Measuring, Governing and Gaining Support for Sustainable Bioenergy Supply Chains. There has already been one webinar offered within this Intertask project. And the title of that one was Approaches to Gain Trust in Sustainability of Bioenergy Through Credible Governance. And you can find that presentation through the link that I have provided there. So you visit ieabioenergy.com, you go to publications and then webinars, and you can find the presentation there. So today the presentation will cover outcome from another objective within this Intertask project. It's objective 1, and it is led by myself and Annette Cowie, who is also the task leader of task 38. It is the climate change task. And this webinar now, or this objective, concerns methods and tools to assess the sustainability of bioenergy. What we have done in this objective is that we have worked with case studies and rather extensive literature reviews to advance the view on methods and tools that are available to assess sustainability. And this is, of course, a very broad area. We look at these tools as very important both for identifying risks, but also for identifying opportunities related to implementing bioenergy. And today we will focus on the opportunities and how these can be understood based on using methods and tools that are appropriate for the purpose. So the webinar then, Biomass Production in Sustainably Managed Landscapes. We will have 2 presentations in a row now. So first Oscar Englund and then Uffe Jorgensen. And after that, we will have a Q&A session where Natasha has kindly offered to help me chair that one. And the reason is that I want to focus on listening to your questions and comments and noting these down. And then I don't want to share at the same time. So I will be a rather quiet chair during this session now. So the first presentation to come now is then by Oskar Englund. The title is Beneficial Land Use Change, Strategic Implementation of New Biomass Cultivation Can Reduce Environmental Impacts in EU Agriculture. Oskar Englund, he is sitting at the same division as myself, so we both sit at Chalmers University of Technology and the Division of Physical Resource Theory. Oskar will actually have one foot at another university starting next year, but we will continue working closely together. So he will have one foot at Chalmers and one foot in Mid-Sweden University. That's a bit further north, where he will get better winters. That's the only reason he moves, actually. So Oskar, he has spent, I think, roughly 10 years now focusing on sustainability aspects of land use in the context where humanity requires increasing resources from a planet with a limited surface. Primarily, he is interested in issues concerning the production and use of biomass for the bioeconomy, which interlinks food, forest, and energy sectors. So these often go very broadly across several sectors. The current research is on land use strategies for increasing biomass production while also providing environmental benefits. Oskar has a large focus on governance, but is also working a lot with GIS. And I would say he's the GIS expert at our division here at Chalmers. Following Oskar's presentation, then comes Uffe Jørgensen's presentation, which is titled Sustainable Intensification of Agricultural Production, Doubling Productivity and Halving Environmental Impacts under Northwestern European Conditions. Both titles impressively long, as you can see. Uffe, he is head of the center at Aarhus University, where research is dedicated to the area of non-food crops and energy aspects within agriculture. And the key focus is on perennial biomass crops. The last years, the focus has been within sustainable intensification of biomass production and use not only for bioenergy but for multiple purposes, so also feed, food and materials. The research is very broad. It's on genotypic variation in yield and fuel quality, protein content and quality, environmental aspects of production, and also national inventories of biomass resources. This new cross-disciplinary center that Uffe is heading, it was started in 2017, so it's a rather new center, but activities at Aarhus University within this area has been going on for many years. I think I will stop the introduction there for the sake of working a bit on better timing here now. And I would like to invite then Oskar to give the first presentation. Yeah, so please, Oskar.
Thank you very much, Göran. Not only is my title impressively long, it's also slightly different on this slide than on the last slide, I just noticed. Sorry about that. The core of my presentation today will be around a project, or the first part of a bigger project that have been conducted in collaboration with Chalmers University, Lund University, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in ISPRA, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and the East Finland University. So, beneficial land use change is something that we have started to talk about. And with that, we refer to land use change that facilitates both new biomass production, but also co-delivers additional benefits, such as supporting biodiversity or enhancing ecosystem services. One form of beneficial land use change is what we call strategic perennialization, referring to the strategic introduction of perennial crops in intensively managed agricultural landscapes. Then to produce biomass, as well as for mitigating environmental impacts from current agricultural land use, including nutrient emissions to water, soil loss by wind and water erosion, losses of soil organic carbon, flooding events, etc. An interesting aspect of these types of production systems is that the beneficial land use change and the associated biomass production could be credited for the additional societal benefit. So, to give a few concrete examples of what we're talking about with strategic perennialization, here we have a landscape with windbreaks. And the windbreaks are there to provide shelter for the cereal cultivation. And this reduces wind erosion and enhances yields. And these windbreaks can be constituted by fast-growing tree species, such as the willow or poplar that can also be harvested for biomass. Another example is the case of riparian buffers or productive riparian buffers. Establishing, again, fast-growing tree species, in this case, short rotation coppice willow or grass species at the edge of the field, close to the watercourse, the runoff of agrochemicals can be avoided. So, what I will present now is the first part of the study that has three objectives. The study is about the potential for strategic perennialization in EU 28. The first objective is to divide the European Union into about 80,000 subcatchments, which we will refer to as landscapes from now on the degree of existing environmental impact. Then in each landscape, we try to estimate the extent to which these impacts can be mitigated by strategic perennialization. And based on the first two objectives, we try to identify areas where strategic perennialization could be particularly beneficial from an environmental perspective. This presentation is primarily about results, but so very brief on the methods that we have used. We have applied spatial indicators for the different environmental impacts, as well as for land use. We've applied those on a pixel level with 50-meter resolution, and then aggregated the results to a sub-catchment level, and combined those results with interpretation advice from the indicator developers to construct a classification. And the first classification we did is what we see here, is the classification of environmental impact. We have 7 maps on this figure. We have on the top row, we have water erosion, wind erosion, and then we have water and wind erosion combined. Then we have nitrogen emissions to water, accumulated losses of soil organic carbon. We have recurring floods. And to the bottom right, we have what we call the dominance of annual crops in each landscape, which is later used to estimate the effectiveness of perennialization. So what we see immediately on these maps is that accumulated losses of soil organic carbon seems to be the most widespread problem of these impacts that we have assessed in Europe. It is classified as being high or very high on almost half of the total land area, and in landscapes containing 70% of the total area under annual crops in the EU. It's also very much spatially correlated with the production of annual crops. If we look at soil loss by water erosion, nitrogen emissions to water, and recurring floods, we see that it is high or very high on between 10 and 15% of the total area and the area under annual crops, but it's not that distributed over Europe as the accumulated soil organic carbon losses. Soil loss by water erosion is mainly problematic in southern Europe, especially Italy. Nitrogen emissions to water is primarily problematic in northwestern Europe, and the recurring floods is problematic around major rivers. And here we zoom into to Denmark and to southern Sweden to see a little bit what it looks like more close up. Here we see the dominance of annual crops in each landscape, ranging from very low to very high. And here we see nitrogen emissions to water, which is very high in large parts of Denmark and not so problematic in Sweden, according to the assessments. Water erosion is not a very big problem in Denmark at all, or in Sweden. Wind erosion is which we saw on the overview slide, or the overview maps. It's not a very big problem at European scale. It only affects about 1% of the total land use, but it's more of a problem in Denmark than water erosion. This is water and wind erosion combined. Here we have accumulated losses of soil organic carbon, high in almost entire Denmark and also large parts of southern Sweden. And recurring floods, not a very big problem in this part of Europe. That's mainly more a problem in, for example, the Danube region, the Po Valley in Italy, and along major rivers in Germany. So here we have the second objective, where we have taken the information on existing environmental impacts and combined that with information about the land use, especially the production of annual crops, to indicate what the effectiveness of perennialization could be in mitigating these impacts. So the four maps that we have here is, we have total erosion, this is water and wind erosion combined. Here we have nitrogen emissions to water, recurring floods, and accumulated soil organic carbon losses. And since the soil organic carbon was the biggest problem overall when it comes to environmental impact, and also spatially correlated with the production of annual crops, we can see that a large part, almost 2/3 of the area total area under annual crops in EU is located in landscape where the effectiveness of mitigating this impact is classified as high or very high by introducing perennials, that is. For total erosion, about a quarter of the area under annual crops is located in landscapes where total erosion could be mitigated with high or very high effectiveness by perennialization. Recurring floods, 16% affect 16% of the area under annual crops, and nitrogen emissions to water just over a tenth, mainly in the northwestern Europe, as we see here. With this information, we tried to see if we could find any areas where perennialization could be particularly beneficial from an environmental perspective. So we defined priority areas, and we defined that in two ways. First, it can be defined as a landscape where one single impact could be mitigated with very high effectiveness by introducing perennials. And that is the yellow colors we see in the map. And 9% of the area under annual crops is located in landscapes fulfilling this requirement or definition. The second definition is that multiple of a priority area could be that multiple impacts can be mitigated with either high or very high effectiveness. And if we require the mitigation of two impacts, then over a third of the total area under annual crops is located in such landscapes. If we require the mitigation of three or more impacts, about a tenth of the area under annual crops is located in priority areas. And for four impacts, it about 1%. Combined, if you combine these two definitions, we get a total area ranging between 15 to 60 million hectares that could be considered priority area for strategic penalization, containing or harboring between 10 and almost up to 50% of the total area under annual crops. And we see also that although these priority areas are rather scattered throughout Europe, there are notable hotspots. We have Denmark, for example, eastern UK, the Po Valley in Italy, and all along the Danube region, for example. So, strategic penalization is certainly nothing new. It has been around for a very long time, but it's uncommon on large scale in modern agriculture. And that is because there are insufficient incentives for farmers. It's not economically competitive typically. The European Union Common Agricultural Policy has historically not supported plantations for biomass feedstock. Knowledge supports inadequate, and there has been a limited demand and low prices for biomass. We see, however, some policy development that are to some extent at least favorable in this respect. Of course, there's an expected increase in biomass demand. We also see that policy may increasingly seek synergies between different objectives, such as climate change mitigation, energy security, and other societal objectives relevant to sustainable development goals. We also see the latest revision of the Common Agricultural Policy currently promotes agricultural practices that enhance biodiversity and ecosystem services, most notably the requirement of ecological focus area, which is required on 5% of large farmlands. And the strategic penalization options that we discuss here today, they qualify for ecological focus areas. So when it comes to implementing these types of production systems, it's important to understand that environmental impacts, they emerge due to an insufficient supply of ecosystem services that can regulate the environmental stressors caused by the production of annual crops. Consequently, the impacts are mitigated by enhancing the ecosystem services supply. And the effects on the supply of ecosystem services from a land use change depend on several factors, such as the type of crop that is used, the location in the landscape, and other biotic and abiotic landscape characteristics, which in principle means that each landscape needs to be evaluated individually. It's generally not sufficient to know only in which landscapes the strategic penalization is likely to be effective, which practically is what we have found out in the first part of this project. Which means that it is necessary to have spatially explicit information on the expected ecosystem services effect from different land use change options in individual landscapes, which requires high-resolution modeling within the landscape. And this, in turn, requires methods and indicators for quantifying effects on ecosystem services from land use change. And for this, we have taken a good step in doing a systematic review of methods for mapping and analyzing ecosystem services in landscapes, so at landscape scale. So apart from looking at the different types of methods, we also attempted to clarify the terminology and typology in ecosystem services research, primarily the concept of landscape and landscape scale. We have published this in a scientific article as well as in an IEA Bioenergy Task 43 report, which you find a link to in this reference. Some key results from that study. Here we see a slightly fuzzy image. To the left here we have ecosystem services according to the CITES classification system. We have provisioning services, regulating and maintenance services, and cultural services. And the length of the bars, they show how many times these different ecosystem services have been mapped in scientific literature. So what we see is that there is a large variation. We see that biomass production life cycle maintenance, referring to the provision of habitat for species, atmospheric composition and climate regulation, primarily global climate regulation, and physical and experiential interactions with nature are commonly mapped, while other ecosystem services, groundwater, pest and disease control, soil formation and composition are not at all as commonly mapped. And this difference depends partly on the perceived importance of the different ecosystem services to society, but also due to differences in the complexity of methods required for mapping them at the landscape scale. Global climate regulation, indicated by the storage of carbon in above ground ecosystems, can be quite easily mapped with appropriate precision using proxy values, while, for example, the mediation of mass flows, referring to erosion control, requires much more difficult methods such as simulation and process models. And these arrows just illustrate which ecosystem services that may be relevant to take into consideration when it comes to assessing potential implementation of strategic penalization options. So for this specific study, we found that for analyzing ecosystem services at the landscape scale, it is required a high level of detail and accuracy, which means that assessments can be challenging. For example, in relation to data collection and data availability and computation capacity. It's difficult also to generalize which methods that are most appropriate, which means that several methods should be considered depending on the research questions you have, the competence of the research team, the data availability, and also the time frame. The review that we performed yielded a comprehensive overview of different method options, which can be useful when it comes to considering methods for these types of assessments. So, next steps in this project is to first identify or define concrete production systems for strategic penalizations, and try to model their introduction into the landscapes where we have found that effectiveness can be sufficiently high. But then this includes also quantifying the corresponding biomass production, which is done by using yield models for the species that are suitable. We also would like to look at the potential trade-offs with these types of production systems. Most notably maybe cropland displacement, and water availability may also be an issue in drier regions because of the high water demand of some of the suitable species. Of course, the practical and economical viability is important to understand, as well as other policy implications, which in turn can affect the practical and economical viability. And finally, to continue method development for the within landscape analysis of ecosystem services and suitable localization of options for beneficial land use change. Yes, that was everything. Thank you very much.
Okay, should I just take over? It's now my turn to speak about sustainable intensification of agricultural production. And thank you, Oscar, for the nice introduction, showing some of the potentials across Europe. Now we are going down in scale to show some examples of what can be done concretely with perennial crops in Denmark, but I think it's something that could have a general interest, at least across the whole northwestern Europe. And European agriculture has been improved incredibly over centuries, but is now facing a lot of challenges because the productivity has stagnated, and at the same time we are looking into very harsh environmental problems and a lot of legal demands for reducing nutrient leaching, reducing the pesticide use, and also preparing a more climate-friendly agriculture. So it's in my opinion time to look for radical innovations instead of the incremental innovations that we have been doing for so many years. That means to shuffle the bag and try to look for new solutions. Because what we did by incremental innovations over those many years has raised the yield of the stable crops that we are having, and this example shows for wheat, how we have reached a ceiling for the productivity. In many countries, in other countries, there is still a yield gap that could be probably filled out. But it seems hard to at least sustainably increase yields in the existing crops in Europe. The reason that it's my statement that we can increase productivity in our cropping systems is that we are not utilizing the resources that we have, like the radiation from the sun. And here I show a kind of a worst case with spring barley in Denmark. It's a crop with a rather short growing season, and it shows the leaf area development in spring barley, which shows that it's only for the green line shows that it's only for maybe 2 months that there's a full productivity crop, and after that it starts maturing, and the field gets yellow, and we will see no photosynthesis in the end of the season, at a point of time where we still have nice temperatures and also a good solar radiation that could provide still a good crop yield, and we often, most often, also have enough water to substitute that. Oh, sorry. So there's a period of the growing season that is totally unutilized, and that's why it's possible to double productivity if we could use some crops that are growing for the whole season. And one of the other major policy focus areas in Denmark is that we should be better in tightening the nitrogen cycle. Historically we have been growing only these single grain crops, and there was a lot of nitrate leaching as shown up here. And we have been improving the systems by implementing winter crops, and now we have catch crops, but actually the most efficient would be a perennial crop that grows all year round, at least in the season, but as soon as temperatures increase, there will be roots in the entire root depth that can take up nutrients, and most often leaching is very low. So to investigate in more detail how this can be improved, we have over a period of years investigated a number of different cropping systems in different sites in Denmark, and a lot of results which I will here only summarize in one slide, shows that we can at the same time increase yield and decrease, in this case, nitrate leaching, which, as I said, is a major focus area in Denmark because we have some shallow sea waters around our country that are often eutrophicated. So the current crops like barley and wheat have quite high concentrations in nitrate of that water that leaves the root zone. That we have installed suction cells below the root zone of the crops to measure that. And they have also a pretty low biomass yield, something like a total of 10 tons dry matter per hectare when we include both straw and grain. And we can double the total productivity. It's on the same field, the same year, that we have produced between 20 and 25 tons of dry matter, and the concentrations of nitrate in the water leaving the root zone was at least halved. And that possible direction we could take is in opposition to what is most often proposed in the public discussion, that we should try to extensify us out of the problems by growing, for example, an unfertilized grass crop. And that also solves the problem with the nitrate concentration, but it's at the cost of the productivity. And I'm not sure that we have that we can afford that under the growing population and or the pressures that we have. So there are many other environmental aspects of farm crops that will be improved by changing from barley and wheat into grass crops. I have to say that this Festuloleum mentioned down here is a grass crop. It's a breed between Festuca and Lolium perenne. And then there are the beetroots here. They are also quite efficient in reducing both nitrate concentrations and improving the productivity. And I also want to show here that the two grasses shown here with the unfertilized grass clover and the heavily fertilized 425 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare gives almost no difference in nitrate leaching because the fertilized grass has been very effective in taking up the fertilizer given. But also the pesticide use is lower in grasses than in grain crops, and we will build up soil carbon as opposed to when we grow annual crops, we most usually decrease soil carbon content. So the only problem we have in Denmark is what the heck to do with all of that grass, because at the moment, of course, the farmers produce the grass that is needed for the cows. And they will not grow more grass just because we say it's better resource use because they need a market, of course. So we have looked into what beneficial components we could find in these grasses, and it's quite interesting to see that the grasses seems to be the crops that can produce the most protein per hectare. And here you see results from one of the field trials with different types of crops. And the white bars here are the grass crops that has a much higher productivity of crude protein per hectare than any of the other crops. And you can see maize and wheat, the stable crops that we are usually growing, only produces half the amount of protein compared to the grasses. But if we want to extract this protein and other components, it's necessary for us to develop a green biorefinery system that is not yet developed in our part of the world. And there are many substances that you can take out from such a refinery, and you can produce many chemicals, but we have in our development tried to focus on what we are good at in Denmark already, that is to produce food and feed, but also to use all residues into biogas production and then to return all nutrients into fertilizer for the cropping. So some slides to exemplify what is going on. We are harvesting grass, and Now we have built a pilot plant to see if we can develop a green biorefinery, and we are feeding in the grass in our pilot plant here. The plant can take something like 1 ton of grass per hour, and it goes through a screw press that makes a grass juice, from which we can precipitate the protein in this tank, and we will afterwards have a protein concentrate that can substitute soy that we are importing between 1 and 2 million tons of for Denmark for our great pig production each year. And here you see the grass juice and also a paste of protein concentrate afterwards. There are then brown juice coming out of this that can be used for biogas. There's quite high content of sugars. Those sugars could also be used for fermentation purposes, for ethanol, but also for many other chemical fermentation processes. At the moment, we are focusing on how to use the protein concentrate. There's been trials with feeding them to organic broilers. And there's a grass pulp that is a good feed for dairy cows. It actually improves the milk production per kilogram of dry matter. But that fiber could also be used for further fermentation into energy products. We also, in cooperation with the University of Copenhagen, made some first studies of the business case in such a green biorefinery, and we expect them to be quite decentralized. So it's not a very large investment. These numbers are in Danish crowns, which is of course not very clear to you, but it's just to show that the area expected to feed such a system is something like 2,000 hectares, which will make it possible to transport the grass not more than maximum 10 kilometers, which because the grass contains 80% of water, and further transport would be not economical. And this feasibility or this business case, I only want to show you that we have investigated 3 different scenarios: a conventional system versus a non-GMO and an organic production of soy substitutes, and it shows the bottom line that it's a good business case, seems to be a good business case already to start a production of an organic soy substitute, while the other productions seems to be not yet a good business case. But what I wanted to point out is also that the brown juice containing all of the possible energy products is given a negative cost here, which is probably not in the long run correct, because we could use it for better purposes and have a higher value out of it. So I think there's a lot of technical possibilities to improve the business case in the future. At the moment, we are building a 10 times bigger facility, and it's in connection to our biogas plant, so that all of the residues will go into biogas production, and this demonstration facility will be at almost commercial scale, and it's also been supported by a number of larger companies that see an interest in this development. Some of the general conclusions from this study is that with grass we can double productivity and half nitrate leaching under our environments in northwestern Europe. we propose to extract the high protein content in grass and legumes and feed the fiber to dairy cattle. But the fiber fraction may be in excess in some cases, and would then be possibly it would then be possible to use it for biogas or the energy productions. We have done feeding trials with monogastric, that means animals with one stomach, and polygastric animals with several stomachs, it's cows. And everything seems quite promising. It seems to be possible to substitute soya with this new protein concentrate. And it seems that it would already now be possible to begin production of an organic soy substitute that seems to give a good business case. At the moment, we are looking into other environmental aspects of this change in cropping systems. What does it mean to nitrous oxide emissions? We also want to document better the soil carbon changes that we expect, and net ecosystem exchange is also being calculated. And finally, I just want to show that the farmers are really eager to change their production, but of course only if there is a market. And even though this is in Danish, I think it would be possible for most of you to see that it says grass is gold. It's a farm magazine, and we tried to keep the editor down to the ground, but he ended up flying high anyway. But we have a lot of support to this change, because it's evident to everybody that if we can at the same time fulfill our the environmental laws that are objected on agriculture, and at the same time we can keep an intensive agriculture with an income, it will benefit everybody. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Oscar and Uffe. And I'll just bring up the chat pod here in the middle of the screen for the Q&A. And so we invite any comments or questions for the presentations in the chat pod now, which should now be in the middle of the screen. And then we'll also be opening the lines. So the phone lines, if anyone does want to ask over the phone, just to state their name, where they're calling from, and then address the question. And then a reminder that there were 2 presentations today, so we welcome questions from both sessions, and then the presenters can then take turns answering the questions. We'll just wait a few moments for questions to come in, and there is a question already from your end. So question to Uffe, how is the interest among politicians in Denmark?
It's been really difficult to our politicians to see how we could fulfill the Water Framework Directive, the European Water Framework Directive, without setting aside significant areas of farmland in Denmark. So, of course, there is quite a significant interest from politicians in this proposed solution. And that's also why they have been supporting us to set up this demonstration facility, but also supported more research in order to get better documentation. And finally, also, they have been launching a program for a more commercial activity on this issue.
Okay, thank you. Now we do have another question in the chat pod. Can you explain the difference to the existing green grass biorefinery in Germany?
Yes, I'm just turning my head around to remember this biomat. I think, are they the one that focuses on the use of the fiber fraction? I think it is, and that's Otherwise, they are also using grass and putting it into a kind of a biorefinery, but they don't have an interest in the protein part, which was so far our focus. But I see a synergy maybe of cooperating with those two ideas.
Okay, great. Now we do have a question from Keys in the chat pod. For the first PowerPoint, are perennials always better for ecosystems? So this would be a question for Oscar.
Yes, I think there are many advantages with perennials in agricultural landscapes because if a landscape is dominated by the intensive cultivation of annual crops, the introduction of perennials is, there is very good support for saying that in many cases that would mitigate those impacts. So in general, perennials are usually better for ecosystem services or for enhancing the supply of ecosystem services, at least in landscapes dominated by annual crops.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we do have some follow-up comments. Yes, they do. And then thank you makes sense. And then a reminder as well, on the left-hand side of the chat pod, there is also a poll set up where we encourage participants to fill out the poll on what sector best represents the nature of your work. And I see that some votes are coming in, so thank you very much. And then just a reminder that if there are any more comments or questions, now's the time. The lines are open. And then as well, you can also type them in the chat pod. So I do think we have another follow-up comment from Keys, so thanks. And then we do have another question for the second presentation. Has the study looked at organic farming and their impact on nitrate leaching?
Well, our study has not looked into that, but that is a great discussion in Denmark. Our conclusion is more or less that there's not a major or not a significant difference in nitrate leaching between organic farming and conventional farming. But it depends on how you look at it. From an area perspective per hectare, there's most often a slightly lower nitrate leaching from organic farming. But per kilo of product, there's often a slightly higher nitrate leaching from organic products than from conventional products. But it also depends a lot of the composition of the farms, which kinds of crops it is, and I would like to stress again, then it's much more important to look at what kinds of crops you are producing. Are you producing annual or perennial crops? That's much more important than looking at what kind of system you are growing, whether it's organic or conventional.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then we do have a comment from Sarah. So are the presentations accessible later on? And then Johan responded, yes, they'll be posted on the IEA Bioenergy website. So both the recording and the PDF should be available. And then I did see a comment from Keys at the beginning. The conclusions were not on the screen. So they were showing up on our end. But again, the presentation file will be available if you did want to look back and take a look at those conclusions. And the recording will also be available as well. And then now's the time if there are any more comments or questions. And I do see someone from David there. Actually, it seems to me that more than the annual versus perennial crop, which is not easy to introduce in southern EU, the point is to have the land efficiently used and covered more time over the year.
Yes, you're more or less right, but I think that perennial crops are more efficient in also covering the root space over the whole season, because when you plow the soil and seed in a new crop, you will have time with very few roots in the soil, and that will increase the risk of leaching. And you can, of course, make more and more sophisticated systems that where you integrate two annual crops, and that's of course you are coming close to as efficient systems as the perennial crops, but it's often hard to come there.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we do have a few people still typing in the chat pod, so we'll give them a moment to come in. There's a follow-up comment from David there. Thanks, I agree. And then from Luke to Oscar, you mentioned 15 to 60 MAH would be the priority area and perennials could be beneficial. How much percentage of this area could then be dedicated to perennials?
That's an excellent question, look, and I look forward to answering it in a couple of months or half a year or so properly, but it depends on what type of perennialization option that is used. If you go for a complete crop shift, well, that could of course replace the entire area of annual crop, but that may not be advisable. If you're talking about riparian buffers, no, that's a bad example. If you're talking about windbreak, for example, that may be in the areas where that is a problem, and maybe 10% of the area under annual crops. So it depends on what type of perennialization option. So, but we are in the process of trying to model this now, and we will be able to answer this much better in a couple of months' time.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Oscar. And just the last call for any comments or questions for either Oscar or Uffe in the chat pod is still open, and as well the phone lines are still open as well if someone did want to ask over the phone. We'll just give a few moments there to see if there's any last minute questions or comments. And then once again, the presentation file and the recording will be available on the IEA Bioenergy website for viewing at a later time. And so I did see someone else typing in the chat pod there, so we might just wait a moment to see if the comment or question will come through. And so a reminder that the poll is also open. If you haven't submitted your vote yet, now's the time. Thank you very much. And so we do have a comment from Tat. Excellent presentation, Uffe and Oscar. Thanks. So it's a comment for both of you.
Thank you very much, Tat.
So Natasha, is it possible to hear me in my mic now?
Yep, we can hear you.
I just wanted to add that so on the IEA Bioenergy website where we will post the presentations, I will investigate with Uffe and Oscar whether some of their scientific papers that are supporting the presentations are publicly accessible. If so, we can also post them there as PDFs.
Oh, sorry, Göran. I think you'll have to talk a bit louder into the microphone.
Okay, so I'm very loud and very close. I'm just saying that we will try and post PDF versions of scientific articles supporting the presentations on the IEA Bioenergy websites, where at the same place as we post the presentations.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And then we do have a follow-up comment from Jim. So yes, thank you. Well done and intriguing for much more work. And then Luke just follow up with thanks for the presentations. All material will be available at the link below. So for any participants on the line, you can copy that link. If you go to the link, you'll be able to see all of the presentation material, and the recording as well will be available shortly following the session. And so if we don't have any more comments or questions, I'd like to bring the session to a close. So thank you all once again for participating in this webinar, and thank you very much to Oscar, Uffe, and Göran for the great presentation and introduction. This was the IEA Bioenergy Webinar series hosted by the Canadian Institute of Forestry, and we hope you have a great day and happy holidays, everyone. Thank you.